Ermey scared the life out of millions of viewers as Gunnery Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket, and for years afterward, fans kept circling back to the same burning question: how much of that man on screen was the real one? The rumors never really died down. Did Ermey see actual combat in Vietnam? Or did he sit out the worst of the war from somewhere safe? Was the shrapnel story something cooked up for press releases? Or did he genuinely carry metal fragments in his body until his final days? Did he ever actually hold the rank people gave him, or was Gunny just a movie nickname that stuck because audiences wanted it to? For casual viewers, maybe those were just fun debates. For veterans, they hit differently. When Ermey passed away on the 15th of April 2018 in Santa Monica, California, at 74 years old, those questions finally started getting real answers. His family came forward. The United States Marine Corps confirmed details that had been fuzzy for years. Service records, military decorations, and documented medical history all surfaced at once, and what they showed was a story far more complicated than even devoted fans had assumed. Before any of that came out, though, Ermey was just a Marine who didn't say much about the war. That silence was a big part of the problem. Quiet invites speculation, and there's never a shortage of people ready to fill a gap with whatever version of the truth feels right to them. Long before Full Metal Jacket made him a household name, Ermey had already spent more than 3 decades building a screen career playing the exact kind of man he had once genuinely been: soldiers, drill instructors, hard-edged authority figures who didn't tolerate weakness from anybody. He was convincing across all of those roles, but nothing touched Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. Stanley Kubrick's 1987 film handed him a platform that fit like a second skin, and he owned every frame of it. The performance was something else entirely. He moved through those barrack sequences with a rhythm and intensity that felt less like craft and more like instinct. People who had never been anywhere near a military installation walked out of that theater completely convinced that what they'd just watched wasn't acting at all. It was autobiography. In a lot of respects, they weren't wrong. The man had worn the uniform for real. He had deployed to an actual war zone. He had come home carrying physical damage from that service, damage that never fully left him. But he almost never brought any of it up publicly, and that restraint gave years of doubt exactly the room it needed to grow. When journalists pressed him on the topic, Ermey had a way of steering the conversation elsewhere without ever coming across as dismissive. He once compared his reluctance to talk about combat to asking someone who lost their whole family in a car crash to sit down years later and walk through every detail of that accident. Time doesn't make that kind of pain smaller. It's a silence that most combat veterans understand instinctively, but to people on the outside, it looked like he was hiding something. And online, hiding something is practically an invitation. Forum threads started piling up. Comment sections filled with competing theories. Fan pages began asking pointed questions, some of them openly hostile. Was Ermey just a rear-echelon Marine who stumbled into a career playing soldiers because he had the right face and the right bark? Was the shrapnel story a piece of studio mythology, invented by someone in a publicity office? Did he actually earn the rank the whole world knew him by? Or did Gunnery Sergeant just follow him home from a Kubrick film and never leave? Those were the questions still floating around when he died. The answers, once they surfaced, told a story worth understanding completely. His death was confirmed by his longtime manager, Bill Roggan, who cited complications from pneumonia as the cause. Within hours, tributes came in from actors, directors, and veterans all across the country. But something else began to take shape in the months and years that followed, something quieter and more deliberate than the rush of public grief. Official military records, statements connected to his family, and direct confirmations from the Marine Corps itself gradually built a picture of a service history that was more layered, more painful, and by nearly every measure far more impressive than anything the internet had been arguing about. What follows is a full account of what's actually been confirmed, drawn from documented records, first-hand interviews, and statements from people who genuinely knew him. No embellishment, no Hollywood polish, just the facts, in the order they happened. To really understand Ermey, you can't start with Full Metal Jacket. You can't even start with the Marine Corps. You have to go back much further, to a small farm on the edge of Kansas City, long before Hollywood or the military had ever heard his name. Ermey was born on the 24th of March, 1944, in Emporia, Kansas, the third of 6 children. For the first 14 years of his life, that farm was essentially his whole world. It was hard, physical work, the kind of upbringing that doesn't leave much room for softness. In 1958, the family moved to Zillah, Washington, a small agricultural town where the pace of life wasn't dramatically different. It wasn't a glamorous childhood by any measure, but it built a specific kind of toughness in him from a very early age. None of that toughness pointed him in a good direction during his teenage years. He kept showing up on the wrong side of local law enforcement, and those run-ins weren't the kind that ended with a warning and a handshake. By 17, he'd already been arrested twice on criminal mischief charges. That stretch of his life tends to get glossed over in the warm tributes that followed his death, but skipping past it misses the whole point, because it's exactly the moment that changed everything. A judge looked at this repeat offender sitting across from him and laid out 2 options: prison or the military. That was the entire choice. It's the sort of dramatic turning point that sounds like something a screenwriter invented, except it happened in a real courtroom, to a real teenager who was one bad call away from a completely different fate. Ermey picked the Marine Corps, and he officially enlisted in 1961. What followed was more than a decade of service that would shape not just who he became as a person, but the whole trajectory of his public life, including everything that eventually played out on film sets years later. His early time in uniform was about as unglamorous as his childhood had been. New recruits don't walk in and get handed real responsibility, and Ermey was no exception, starting out in aviation support and learning military structure from scratch. But his next assignment is the one that quietly set the course for everything else. From 1965 to 1967, he served as a drill instructor at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. That posting, more than any single experience before or after it, became the actual foundation of his acting career, even though nobody standing on that parade deck in 1965 could have seen it coming. Think about what that job really demands. Every morning, before the civilian world has even opened its eyes, you're standing in front of a group of 18-year-olds who still think and move and react like civilians. Your entire job is to take that apart completely and rebuild it into something the Corps can actually use. Ermey did exactly that, day after day, year after year, with real authority and not a single camera in sight. He wasn't performing a character. He was living one, long before Stanley Kubrick ever came calling. When his time as a drill instructor ended, Ermey was sent overseas to Okinawa, Japan, where he served at Marine Corps Air Station Futenma with Marine Wing Support Group 17. It was one more entry in a service record that kept growing, adding layers to a man the public would eventually flatten into a single iconic movie role. For a while, it looked like Ermey's military career might stay rooted in the Pacific, well clear of the war consuming an entire generation of young Americans across the South China Sea. That distance didn't hold. By 1968, his path changed completely, and the story most people think they know about R. Lee Ermey in Vietnam gets far more complicated from there. This is the part of his record that people have argued over the most. Did Ermey actually serve in Vietnam? Or was that section of his biography quietly burnished over the years to cement his reputation as the hardest man in any room? Corners of the internet treated it as an open question for decades. The service records, though, don't leave much room for doubt. In 1968, Ermey received orders to South Vietnam, deploying with his unit, Marine Wing Support Group 17. The documentation is straightforward. He spent 14 months in country. That's not a symbolic rotation meant to add a line to someone's file, and it's not a quick stopover between comfortable postings. 14 months inside an active war zone is a serious commitment, and that fact alone should close most of the debate. Where things got muddied was in the details surrounding what he actually did during those 14 months, and that's where online speculation drifted toward 2 very different conclusions, both of which missed the real picture. Ermey wasn't a frontline infantry rifleman charging through jungle firefights every day, the way the young recruits he'd later portray and train in Full Metal Jacket were. That distinction matters, and it's been pulled in both directions by people pushing an angle. Marine Corps officials confirmed to military.com that across his career, Ermey served in roles that included both rifleman and repair shop mechanic. That combination says something real. It describes someone operating inside a combat zone environment, close to the machinery and logistics that kept a war functioning, not someone parked behind a desk in a secured compound, far from any genuine danger. The truth about Ermey's service sits somewhere between two camps that both get it wrong. One side says he saw nothing worth talking about. The other treats him like some undocumented war hero operating in the shadows. Both miss what the actual record shows, which is a man in a real war zone, close enough to real danger that he didn't walk away from it clean. Nobody who has looked seriously at his record disputes that part. Ermey came home from Vietnam wounded, shrapnel in his back and his arm. He didn't leave that country the same way he arrived. That metal stayed in his body, and it never came out. In a 1987 interview with the New York Times, he mentioned that a rocket had effectively ended his military career in 1969. He said it plainly, didn't dress it up, didn't build a story around it. That was it. That restraint alone says something, because it cuts directly against the narrative that he inflated his service record to boost his Hollywood profile. The shrapnel wasn't manufactured by a publicist. It wasn't a detail that conveniently appeared after Full Metal Jacket turned him into a household name. It was known and documented well before Stanley Kubrick ever thought to cast him. The injury came first. The war came first. The career came after, not the other way around. Consider what that looks like across an entire public life. Every drill instructor role, every high-intensity scene, every red carpet appearance and television interview over decades, Ermey was carrying a piece of metal inside his body from a rocket that hit in 1969. The war didn't stay behind when he boarded the plane home. It came with him, and it stayed. When his Vietnam deployment ended, the Corps didn't give him time to decompress. He was reassigned to Okinawa, kept working, kept climbing, and earned a promotion to staff sergeant. He absorbed the physical cost of that deployment without making it a talking point or asking anyone to notice. That kind of quiet persistence reveals something real about who he was. He didn't trade on his wounds for sympathy, didn't lean on his combat proximity when things got difficult, and didn't treat the uniform as something to step away from the moment the hard part was over. He just kept going. So what did the Marine Corps actually put on the record? This is where years of forum speculation and second-hand stories collide with documented fact, and the documented fact doesn't budge. Military.com went directly to Marine Corps officials and got confirmation on Ermey's full decoration record. His awards included 2 Good Conduct Medals, the National Defense Service Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal with Bronze Star device, the Vietnam Campaign Medal with device, the Vietnam Gallantry Cross with Palm Unit Citation, a Meritorious Unit Commendation, and the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal. That's not a rumor passed around a comment section. That's a sourced list from a sourced outlet. And it's not a hollow list either. This isn't the kind of record you build by showing up, keeping your head down, and polishing your boots. The Vietnam Gallantry Cross with Palm and the Bronze Star device on his service medal are both tied directly to combat zone activity and recognized unit performance. You don't collect those from behind a desk somewhere far from the action. Some biographical sources also note a sharpshooter badge and a marksman badge among his qualifications. That detail carries more weight than people usually give it credit for, especially given all the back and forth online about what Ermey's service actually looked like. He wasn't attached to a Marine unit in some administrative support role while other men did the hard work nearby. He trained the same way they trained, qualified on weapons the same way they qualified, and was held to the same field standards as every other Marine around him. The injuries he carried out of that service were serious enough to take the decision out of his hands entirely. He didn't leave the Corps on his own schedule. Medical retirement became necessary, and he was discharged from active duty in 1972. This wasn't some quiet paperwork exit or a convenient early out. His body had paid a price the Corps couldn't look past, and the medical record made that plain. His final rank has been listed slightly differently depending on the source, which has fueled a bit of confusion over the years. The most consistent accounts put him at staff sergeant at the time of his medical retirement. A smaller number of sources place his rank as high as master sergeant by 1971, during his final stretch of service in Okinawa. The specific notation shifts a little depending on who's citing what, but the core facts around his medical discharge and the reasons behind it line up across every documented account. That part, nobody argues with. Here's something that tends to stop people cold, especially those who know Ermey only from Full Metal Jacket or his later TV appearances. He was never actually a gunnery sergeant during his time on active duty. Not a single day. The rank he genuinely earned and held in the Marine Corps was staff sergeant, which means the assumption most people carry around about his title is built on a foundation that doesn't hold up. So how did gunnery sergeant enter the picture? In 2002, Marine Corps Commandant General James L. Jones made a move that had never happened before and, by all accounts, hasn't happened since. He granted Ermey an honorary promotion to gunnery sergeant, making him the only Marine in history to receive that specific distinction after already leaving active service. This wasn't a casual PR gesture or some Hollywood arrangement. It was a deliberate, formal act by the highest-ranking officer in the entire Marine Corps, extended to a man whose service record had clearly left something worth honoring, even decades after the fact. That one quietly documented, fully verifiable detail puts one of the most persistent myths about Ermey to rest. The gunnery sergeant title was completely real. It just didn't come from the place most people imagined. A lot of people assume some production meeting is where gunnery sergeant got pinned onto him, that a writer or casting director thought it sounded right and ran with it. The truth goes in exactly the opposite direction. The Marine Corps itself, long after his active service ended, formally elevated him to that rank as a genuine tribute. It honored not only what he'd done while wearing the uniform, but everything he did afterward, the decades of publicly supporting active duty troops through his acting career, his charity work, and his consistent television presence advocating for the military community. The move from Marine to Hollywood was anything but smooth or obvious. Being medically discharged in 1972 left Ermey without a clear path forward. He wasn't some young recruit stepping off a bus and figuring out who he was for the first time. He was a man who had spent 11 consecutive years inside one of the most structured institutions on the planet. And then overnight, none of that structure was there anymore. Civilian life doesn't hand anyone a mission briefing. It doesn't tell you where to be or what comes next. For someone who had operated inside that rigid framework since his teenage years, that sudden silence must have been genuinely disorienting. His first move after leaving the Marines wasn't exactly a triumphant new beginning. In a 1997 Entertainment Weekly interview, Ermey talked openly about buying a beat-up bar in Okinawa, trying to build something from the ground up in a city he knew from his years in uniform. It didn't work out. Japanese authorities eventually connected the business to black market activity, and Ermey had no choice but to walk away from the whole thing. That chapter rarely shows up in the polished tributes written about him, but it's worth knowing. It shows a man who was genuinely scraping, trying to figure out who he was outside the only life he'd ever really lived. No rank, no clear mission, and nobody telling him what to do next. Eventually, he made his way to the Philippines, and that move started to shift things. He began studying drama there, something he hadn't seriously tried before, and started picking up roles in Filipino productions. It was slow, unglamorous work, but it put him in exactly the right place at the right time. Director Francis Ford Coppola was shooting Apocalypse Now in the region during the late 1970s, and the two crossed paths during that production. Coppola brought Ermey on as a technical advisor, someone who could make the military elements feel real rather than rehearsed. He also stepped in front of the camera in a small role, appearing as a helicopter pilot in the now iconic helicopter attack sequence that audiences still talk about decades later. This is where one of the more stubborn myths about Ermey starts to fall apart. The popular version of his story tends to squeeze the timeline, making it sound like he came back from Vietnam, caught Hollywood's eye almost right away, and walked into a screen career while the dust was still settling. That's simply not what happened. There was nearly a full decade between his medical discharge in 1972 and anything resembling a real foothold in the film industry. That gap was filled with reinvention, a failed bar in Okinawa, drama classes in the Philippines, and bit parts in films most people have never heard of. It was a grind, not a grand entrance. A film called Full Metal Jacket changed everything for Ermey, though not through the door most people assume he walked through. He wasn't cast in it initially. He was brought on as a technical advisor, someone to keep things authentic behind the camera, and that included sitting in on interviews with extras being considered for smaller roles. During those sessions, he started reading the drill instructor's lines out loud, partly to give the room a sense of what that kind of commanding authority actually sounded like in practice. Someone had the good sense to roll tape. When Stanley Kubrick watched the footage back, he saw something that no formal audition had turned up. He removed the original actor from the role and handed it to Ermey, a decision that would shape both the film and Ermey's career for the next several decades. Here's what really tells you something about the man. Those vicious, profanity-laced tirades that Gunnery Sergeant Hartman unleashes on his recruits didn't come from Kubrick's pen. Ermey reportedly wrote most of that material himself. Stanley Kubrick, one of the most notoriously controlling directors in Hollywood history, basically handed Ermey ownership of those scenes and stepped back. That says everything about the level of raw authenticity he brought to the set. The role turned him into a household name almost overnight. He'd done solid work in film and television before Full Metal Jacket, but nothing that had burned his face and voice into the public imagination quite like Hartman. Suddenly, everyone recognized that posture, that voice, that brand of terrifying command, and audiences believed every bit of it for a straightforward reason. The character wasn't much of a stretch for him. Loud, unshakable, relentlessly demanding, that was already Ermey. He wasn't reaching for a performance so much as channeling a version of himself he'd spent years becoming inside the real Marine Corps. When Ermey died in April 2018, the tributes came quickly. Veterans, actors, directors, and fans of Full Metal Jacket all responded within hours of the news breaking. His longtime manager, Bill Roggan, confirmed the death, stating that Ermey had passed from complications of pneumonia. That fact spread fast. What took considerably longer to come into focus was the deeper story, the full toll that Vietnam had taken on his body, and the extent of the formal recognition that the military establishment would eventually extend to him in the months that followed. As tributes rolled in from across the country, more details started surfacing through family statements and direct confirmations from Marine Corps sources. What came together wasn't a correction of anything people thought they knew. It was something closer to a filling in. Background details that had technically always been on record but never made the rounds while Ermey was alive. He wasn't the type to go around reciting his own service history for public approval. He lived it, and the record held, whether he brought it up or not. The burial arrangements spoke for themselves. In January 2019, roughly 9 months after his death, Ermey's ashes were laid to rest in Section 82 of Arlington National Cemetery. About 100 people attended, including family, friends, and fans who made the trip specifically to be there. The ceremony included a military firing party, a casket team, a bugler, and the formal folding and presentation of the American flag, the full honors reserved for those who genuinely earned them. Arlington doesn't take everyone. Eligibility runs directly through a veteran's service record, and in many cases through documented injury or valor tied to that service. The standards are strict, and they don't get waived for someone's screen credits. Ermey's burial there wasn't a courtesy extended to a famous actor who once played a Marine in a movie. It was a quiet but completely unambiguous confirmation that his military file held up under scrutiny, as direct a validation as any official paperwork could offer. The Department of Veterans Affairs added its own public recognition around the same time, naming Ermey a Veteran of the Day. Their summary covered his full service window from 1961 to 1972, noting his 14-month deployment to Vietnam, 2 separate tours in Okinawa, and his years shaping recruits as a drill instructor. They closed with a line that needed nothing added to it. "Semper Fi, Gunny. We honor his service." Put all of it side by side and there's nothing left to reasonably challenge. Medical records documenting his wounds. Medal citations confirmed by Marine Corps officials after his death. An honorary promotion to gunnery sergeant personally authorized by a sitting commandant in 2002, and a full military honors burial inside Arlington National Cemetery. Every piece of that record points the same direction. Not one element pulls against another. When you lay out R. Lee Ermey's full military record from start to finish, what you get isn't the character, and it isn't the Hollywood image. What you get is the actual man, a veteran whose injuries were real, whose medals were earned, and whose burial place reflects what he did while wearing a uniform, not what he did in front of a camera. So, what does the record actually say once you clear away all the noise? Strip out the years of forum debates, the skeptical comment threads, the online speculation, and what remains is a documented service history that holds up far better than his critics ever wanted to admit. The idea that Ermey never truly served in Vietnam and simply played a convincing Marine on screen doesn't survive the evidence. He was formally ordered to South Vietnam in 1968, served 14 months in country with Marine Wing Support Group 17, and that fact is confirmed across military records and multiple independent biographical sources. This wasn't recycled press release copy. It was verified, repeatedly and consistently, by documentation that had absolutely nothing to do with Hollywood. Then there's the shrapnel wound. The suggestion that the whole story was invented after the fact, some studio-manufactured detail designed to make him seem more authentic, collapses the moment you look at the timeline. He was wounded in the back and arm during his Vietnam deployment, and he carried that shrapnel for the rest of his life. That detail appears in interviews and biographical accounts going back decades, long before Full Metal Jacket, long before most people even knew his name. If someone invented it, they invented it very early and maintained it with extraordinary consistency. They didn't. It happened. The rank question is where things get genuinely interesting, and it's also where most of the online debate completely misses the point. His earned rank during active service was Staff Sergeant. That's the factual baseline, full stop. But the gunnery sergeant distinction wasn't just a film title that leaked into real life over time. It was awarded to him honorarily in 2002, personally approved by the sitting Marine Corps Commandant, and it came attached to something that had never happened before and hasn't happened since. He became the only Marine in recorded history to receive that specific honorary promotion after already separating from the Corps. An institution built on tradition doesn't make exceptions like that for publicity. It makes them when it believes the recognition is genuinely deserved. The combat question deserves a straight answer, not a simplified one that falls neatly to either side. Ermey wasn't a frontline infantryman running daily patrols through dense jungle the way the raw recruits he'd later coach on film were. Marine Corps officials themselves documented his roles as rifleman and repair shop mechanic. But he was present in an active war zone for more than a year, and his deployment didn't wind down on any kind of schedule. It ended because he got hurt. The wound was serious enough to pull him out of the field entirely, and he described it himself as a rocket strike. That's not a quiet, sheltered posting behind the action. That's close enough to leave a mark that stays with you. And it did stay with him. He carried that shrapnel without ever making it the centerpiece of his public image, quietly and without fanfare, for the rest of his life. The Marine Corps itself confirmed the core details on the record, not a studio, not a publicist. When the institution that issued his orders, tracked his service, and approved his honorary rank is the one standing behind the story, anyone arguing it was invented has a very steep hill to climb. The claim that his medals and commendations were inflated or manufactured to polish his Hollywood profile doesn't hold up either. The record exists, and it was built long before anyone in the film industry was paying attention. After Ermey passed, Marine Corps officials went directly on the record with military.com to confirm his complete service history and full list of decorations. That closed the debate for good. Whatever fans had assembled from his film roles over the years, the official documentation told a far cleaner and more complete story than any rumor ever managed to. And what a story it genuinely was. A teenager with a serious criminal record, facing a stark choice handed down by a judge, walked into the Marine Corps and never once looked back. He became a drill instructor, shaped hundreds of recruits, shipped out to Vietnam, and came home with shrapnel in his back that doctors never fully removed. He carried that weight, literally, for the remainder of his life, and he almost never brought it up. The recognition he earned wasn't ceremonial in any hollow sense. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest-ranking officer in the entire branch, personally acknowledged Ermey and elevated him to the honorary rank of gunnery sergeant. The Corps doesn't hand that out casually. It reflects a genuine regard for what a man gave, both while in uniform and in the decades that followed. When he died, the Marines didn't simply issue a statement or send flowers, they brought him home. Full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most solemn and respected burial grounds in the country. That final tribute said more about how the Corps truly viewed Lee Ermey than any film credit ever could. For years, online chatter tried to poke holes in Ermey's story. Some said he inflated his record, others claimed the whole tough guy persona was something Hollywood invented. Then the verified facts came out, and those arguments collapsed one by one. His actual biography didn't need a single thing added to it. The real version was already gripping on its own terms, no exaggeration required. He never needed film roles to prove what he was worth. The credibility was already there, built across jungles and training depots and operating rooms, long before any casting director ever heard his name. He carried that weight quietly, right up until the very end. Stories like this one are exactly why this channel exists. If you got something out of it, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are plenty more histories where the truth turns out to be far more gripping than any legend ever was. See you in the next one.